Public transport. Many of us rely on it to get us from A to B, whether it be the trains or buses. Those who depend on it don't realise how crucial it is to keep the day-to-day operations functioning. It's also a great way to meet new people and form new relationships. How many of you have heard of stories where people meet the loves of their lives while taking the morning commute? However, not everyone we meet on public transport can describe such positive tales. Today, we'll be discussing one occasion where perhaps the worst kind of encounter can occur while travelling. A story where one man was in the wrong place at the wrong time, where murder was the unforeseen destination. Today, we'll be discussing the case of Tim McLean and how he met a cruel and horrifying end at the hands of a man who was instructed to slay Tim, apparently by God. The man's name, Vincent Lee. Timothy Richard McLean Jr. was born in British Columbia on the 3rd of October 1985. His parents, Carol Dadelli and Timothy McLean Sr., had separated when Tim was young, but maintained a good relationship. Tim would regularly split time between both parents, ensuring he spent as much time with them as he could. He also came from a very large family, all of whom adored Tim dearly. Friends and family would describe Tim as a very active person with an energetic spirit. He was also incredibly keen to interact with those around him. Tim was not a shy person. People would say that Tim could easily make friends. He was also a keen traveller. In his teenage years, he became a carny, travelling around with the carnival across Canada. This was something Tim really enjoyed. He was making good money working with the carnival and loved travelling with what he considered to be his extended family. However, by the time he reached 22 years old, Tim was ready to settle down and decided on moving to British Columbia. In late July 2008, while Tim was working the Klondike Days exhibition in Edmonton before travelling to their next stop in Regina, Tim decided to travel back to Winnipeg to make arrangements for his eventual move to British Columbia. Friends had offered to pay for a plane ticket for Tim to travel from Edmonton to Winnipeg. Tim declined their offer, as he preferred to travel by coach. He felt there was a certain feel to it that couldn't be replicated via a plane journey. He simply preferred travelling on the road. Just after midnight on the 30th of July 2008, Tim arrived at the Greyhound bus depot, where he would board the bus 1170 to Winnipeg. The trip would see Tim take a 24-hour long journey back home. However, for Tim, he was never going to make it home. Fate had dealt Tim a fatal hand that day, a hand which nobody could have predicted. Vincent Lee was born in China on the 30th of April 1968. Lee was an educated man who in 1992 graduated from the Wuhan Institute of Technology with a Bachelor of Science degree in computers. Between 1994 to 1998, Vincent worked in Beijing as a software engineer. In 2001, Lee and his wife moved to Canada. However, due to their language barrier, Lee was only able to attain menial work initially after moving to Winnipeg for the Grant Memorial Church, where he was a member. The pastor there, Tom Castor, stated that Vince seemed to do well at the church despite the language barrier, and appeared to get on well with the other congregation members, although he would appear to be frustrated at times because he couldn't communicate as well as he was able to. There were no reported issues with Lee's anger or any other kind of trouble before his departure from the church in the spring of 2005, where he would go on to work as a forklift operator. In 2006, Lee unexpectedly left his wife and moved to Edmonton, although she would go on to rejoin him soon after. There, he would continue to work various low-paying jobs, including working at Walmart, a fast food restaurant, and in newspaper delivery. Lee was described by his boss at Walmart as a reliable, hard worker who showed no signs of trouble. Lee would also obtain Canadian citizenship in November of that same year. Vincent Lee's relationship with his wife would begin to deteriorate, and eventually the two would separate. In 2008, Lee had asked his boss at Walmart for time off so he could attend a job interview at Winnipeg, but was fired shortly after making this request for getting into an altercation with other store employees. On the 29th of July 2008, Lee boarded a Greyhound bus headed to Winnipeg. Lee got off the bus at approximately 6 p.m. in Erickson, Manitoba. he would get off with around 3 pieces of his luggage. There, he would sit on a park bench near a local grocery store, where he was reported to have been seen sitting there at 3 a.m, with his eyes wide open and sat firmly upright. When the 30th of July rolled around, he placed a makeshift for sale sign on his laptop for $600. As a teenage boy was passing, Lee asked the boy if he would like to buy the laptop. Initially, the boy refused as he didn't have the money for it, understandably. However, Lee asked the boy how much he had. When the boy responded saying he only had $60, Lee agreed to the sale of the relatively new laptop. At 6:55 p.m, almost 24 hours since Vincent Lee got off the bus, a Greyhound bus 1170 arrived at the Erickson, Manitoba stop, where Lee got on board. Nobody could have ever expected what was going to happen next. Initially, when Lee boarded the Greyhound bus 1170, he sat at the front of the bus. Vincent Lee was described as approximately 6 foot with a shaved head and sunglasses. At around 8 p.m, the bus stopped for a scheduled rest stop, where Lee departed the bus and smoked a cigarette before returning. This time, Lee did not return to his original seat. Despite there being spare seats on the bus, Lee would walk up the aisle, scanning the seats and the passengers on board. As he approached the sleeping Tim McLean, Tim stirred, turned around to see Lee standing there by him. Tim acknowledged him in a friendly manner before turning around to go back to sleep while listening to music on his earphones. Lee, seeing Tim's gesture as a friendly one, decided to sit next to him. Vincent Lee pulled out a toilet roll and a 2-litre bottle of Cool Nest tea. Witnesses stated that Lee did not let go of the toilet roll during his time sitting next to Tim, placing the roll under his chin when taking swigs from the bottle. Witnesses also said that Lee became fixated onto Tim almost immediately after sitting next to him. They could hear him murmuring to himself, almost chanting, but couldn't understand as he was speaking in Chinese at the time. Things were pretty uneventful. The Mask of Zorro was playing on the bus's TV at the time, and one passenger said they had a choice, whether to fall asleep or watch the film. But at around 8:30 p.m, that would change. Lee pulled out a knife, and without warning, he began to stab a sleeping Tim McLean repeatedly. A blood-curdling scream was let out by Tim, and in a rush of adrenaline, he leapt over a manic Lee and fell onto the aisle of the bus. One passenger shouted to the driver to stop the bus, while confused passengers were still trying to figure out what exactly they were witnessing. Lee was not fazed. He would continue his vicious attack on Tim, stabbing repeatedly, over and over and over again, his face unemotional, some would say robotic in nature. Lee was completely focused on unleashing his deadly attack on Tim and paid little to no attention to the other passengers. Eventually, the bus stopped and the passengers evacuated the bus. The bus driver too would get off, but not before activating the immobilizer on the bus, preventing Lee from driving away and putting more lives at risk. By this time, Tim had been stabbed approximately 50 to 60 times. Truck driver Chris Alguire, who was on the same stretch of road as the bus, saw the vehicle stationary and decided to pull over to see if he could assist, thinking that the bus had broken down. He noted that the passengers had a look of terror on their faces. Upon hearing one of the passengers shout out that a man was being stabbed on the bus, he went to the back of his truck, collected a metal pipe, and he, along with another passenger, had then boarded the bus, hoping to save Tim's life and stop Lee's brutal attack. Not only was it too late to save Tim, but what Chris, the passengers, and emergency services were about to witness would haunt them all to this day. Upon entering the bus, Chris and the other passengers saw Lee continuing to mutilate Tim's body. According to Chris, Lee looked at both of them, no emotion on his face, before turning his attention back to Tim, where he then began to behead him. A shocked Chris and passenger could only watch in horror and disbelief at what they were seeing. When Lee had finished, he stood up, knife in one hand, Tim's head in the other, and began to walk down the aisle towards the stunned pair. They both quickly retreated out of the bus, where Lee would stand on the other side of the closed door before dropping Tim's head on the stairs of the bus and returning to the rest of Tim's remains. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police quickly arrived on the scene. However, As Lee was locked inside of the bus with no route of escape, the passengers safely outside of the bus, and it already being too late to save Tim, they were unable to do anything other than watch, in the hope Lee would tire out from his frenzied attack. Chris had asked one of the marksmen trained on Lee to take him out, but because of Canada's preservation of life policy, they couldn't, as Lee at the time posed no threat to anyone else. Chris had even pondered why they couldn't use tear gas on the bus, as this would at least be a non-lethal means of stopping Lee. For the next 4 hours, they would watch in horror and communicate to each other through radio, as the man they codenamed Badger cut Tim up into several pieces and even ate parts of him, including his eyes and a third of his heart.
Badger appears to be a 6 foot tall Asian male, short dark hair, black t-shirt, armed with a knife right now. Badger is armed with a knife and a pair of scissors, and he's defiling the body at the front of the bus as we speak. Zulu Delta 1 at your leisure, could you give me a shout? Delta 1, Zulu 4. Okay, Badger's at the back of the bus, hacking off pieces and eating it.
Eventually, Vincent Lee would try to escape through a back window of the bus that he'd smashed, but was quickly stopped when he was tasered twice by police and arrested. Tim's ear, nose and tongue were found in Vincent Lee's pockets. Upon finally being able to gain access to the bus, police were greeted with the horror of Lee's actions. Tim's body had been mutilated so brutally that he was scattered all over the bus. He was beyond recognisable. News quickly spread of the incident unfolding on bus 1170. The next day, Tim's mother, Carol, heard about the incident on the news while working at a local seniors' home where she cooked dinner. She initially dismissed the possibility that her son was the victim, as she believed he had already arrived home before the time the attack took place. She even told residents there that could have been my son. She and the residents would later say a group prayer for the family before tucking into their meals. Timothy Sr. was completely unaware of the incident altogether. The day after the incident took place, he was expecting his son to join him for dinner and collected his favourite meal, a bucket of fried chicken. However, upon arriving home, he was greeted by Tim's friends who had asked him if he was aware as to what happened, to which he replied no. They would then take him indoors and turn on a computer, where Timothy would learn of the brutal killing of his son. Timothy then contacted his ex-wife to break the news to her. Their world had fallen apart. What drove Vincent Lee to commit such a violent and brutal attack on a man he didn't know, whose only interaction prior to the attack was a brief, friendly acknowledgement? This was something investigators had to figure out. What they would find would call into question the policies and procedures Canadian health systems have in place, and whether Vincent Lee could have been capable of such a monstrous act had he been identified much earlier. It would also call into question Greyhound's own security, and how a man could board one of their buses with a deadly weapon. One week after killing Tim McLean, Vincent Lee was taken to the psychiatric ward of the Health Sciences Centre in Winnipeg. In short, Tim was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Vincent Lee was determined to be suffering from schizophrenia. However, his illness had been going on for some time, undiagnosed. It's believed one reason for the failure to diagnose Vincent's condition was due to Vincent's own language barrier. Vincent would be placed on the appropriate medication to tackle his schizophrenia, and as time passed, his condition eased. He was then able to open up to Dr. Stanley Yaron, who was tasked with assessing whether Vincent Lee was mentally capable to stand trial. Lee would initially say that he was solely responsible for the death of Tim. He acknowledged that it was his hands that killed him. However, he would tell Stanley, quote, "I am the evil son of an evil God. God chose me as the killer and chose Tim McLean as the victim." When asked why, he replied, "I don't know. God controls all people for his own reasons." He would also state that God had told him that aliens were going to invade Earth and that he had to kill them. After murdering Tim, Vince would go on to say that God told him that he had to die. He would ask for the death penalty to be imposed upon him. The only problem with his request is that Canada doesn't have capital punishment. He would threaten to kill himself if the state would not end his life for him. On the 5th of March 2009, and after 19 meetings with Vincent Lee, it was unanimously determined by Stanley Yaron and the courts that Lee couldn't be held criminally responsible for Tim McLean's death. Lee was then transferred to a psychiatric hospital where he would continue to undergo treatment for his schizophrenia and rehabilitation. In 2015, Vincent Lee won the right to be moved to a group home, moving from the previously secure wing he was staying in. In 2016, Lee, now going by Will Baker, after successfully changing his name, was granted increased freedoms, including escorted trips to local communities. On Monday, the 6th of February 2017, Will Baker was discharged absolutely and his record expunged. Despite concerns over his mental well-being, as well as the possibility that Baker could potentially commit a similar offence, the Province of Manitoba, Canada Review Board found that Mr. Baker does not pose a significant threat to the safety of the public. Quote, Will Baker is a free man as of today. As of 2018, he lives in a Manitoba community, independently. Naturally, the idea that Lee could have ever walked out a free man didn't sit well with the McLean family. Carol Dedelli had been tirelessly campaigning for changes to the law and had drafted a bill dubbed Tim's Law, which aims to put the needs of the victims ahead of those of the perpetrator. However, she ended her petition in January 2014 after just 1,200 signatures were collected. Timothy Sr. also struggled to cope with the loss of his son. In memory of Tim, he tattooed his favourite picture of his son on his chest to keep him close to his heart. Chris Alguire also struggled with depression and alcohol problems since the incident. To this day, he cannot understand the decision to give Lee a complete discharge. The other passengers on that fateful night have also had their own demons to deal with. One woman who gave birth several years later initially had her child taken away due to concerns over her mental health and PTSD following the attack. However, she was reunited with her child after 18 months, where the child was in foster care. 2 Ontario women also filed a lawsuit seeking $3 million each against Greyhound after witnessing the murder of Tim McLean. However, this case was dropped in 2015. Greyhound were also forced to pull an advertising campaign in light of the murder. The slogan said, "There's a reason you've never heard of bus rage." PETA were also heavily criticised after creating advertising material comparing Tim's murder to the slaughter of animals. The only shining light in this whole case was that on December 2008, Tim's girlfriend gave birth to their son. Carol Dedelli calls him a gift from God, sent by her son to give her reason to get up every day. Tim's son has been living with Dedelli and her husband since 2015, after a bitter custody dispute since 2009. They were awarded permanent guardianship in 2016. Thank you for taking the time to watch today's video. I wanted to end this by saying that, while researching this case, I felt like Tim would be the kind of person I'd like to have known. You can find many tributes for Tim across the internet, and it was clear to me that he touched many people's lives in the short time he had with them. I do think that while mental health is a serious issue, especially in today's world, I do feel as though the Canadian government does need to take a deeper look into how the victims are treated in cases like this. But let me know what you think. I'd really like to read your comments and get your thoughts on the case. If you'd like to see more content like this, please give this video a like, as it really helps the channel. Please also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you know when I next upload. If you could also share this with people you know who like true crime, that would be really appreciated. So yeah, all being well, I'll be back next Sunday with another true crime video. Take care, and goodbye. For now.